The rain fell in soft, silver sheets outside the window, blurring the world beyond the glass into a watercolor of green and gray. Margaret Thompson sat in her armchair, a cup of chamomile tea cooling on the table beside her, the steam curling upward like a fading memory. Her home in the suburbs of Seattle, Washington, was quiet tonight, save for the gentle patter of rain on the roof and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Every corner of this house held a story, every scuff on the hardwood, every nick in the kitchen counter, every daisy blooming defiantly in the front yard despite the autumn chill. This was the house she and her husband, Robert, had built together, brick by brick, dream by dream. The kitchen still carried the faint scent of his coffee. Even now, 3 years after his heart gave out in that lonely office downtown. Margaret was 74, her hair a soft silver that caught the lamplight, her eyes still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wasn't frail, not yet, though her knees ached when the weather turned damp like tonight. She could still tend her garden, still read her Steinbeck novels by the fireplace, still hum Ella Fitzgerald tunes while baking peach cobbler from scratch. She wasn't ready to be erased, not by time, not by anyone. But erasure, she would soon learn, doesn't always come with a warning. It began with a rug. A simple, foolish thing. A braided throw rug in the living room that caught her foot one evening as she reached for a book on the shelf. She stumbled, not badly, just enough to bruise her hip and rattle her pride. She laughed it off, dusted herself, and went to bed with an ice pack and a stubborn refusal to make a fuss. But the next morning, her son David was at her door before the sun had fully risen. His knock sharp and impatient, like a man on a mission. David was 42, all pressed suits and clipped sentences, his dark hair slicked back, his eyes carrying a coldness Margaret could never quite place. He stood in her foyer, briefcase in hand, looking less like her son and more like a stranger delivering bad news. "Mom," he said, not meeting her gaze. "We need to talk." She offered him coffee, tried to lighten the air with a story about the neighbor's cat sneaking into her garden again. But he waved it off. "No time," he said, setting his briefcase on the dining table with a thud. "I heard about the fall." Margaret blinked, her smile faltering. "It was nothing, David. A bruise. I'm fine." He didn't sit down, didn't ask how she felt. "It's not fine," he said, his voice flat, efficient. "You're alone here. You could have broken something. A hip, your neck. It's too risky." She laughed, thinking it a joke, her hand brushing the air as if to swat away his words. "David, I'm not going anywhere. This is my home." But he wasn't laughing. His eyes flicked to the window, then back to her, and in that moment she saw it. A decision already made, a plan already set. "We found a facility," he said. "It's good, modern, safe. It's the best option for everyone." The word facility landed like a stone in her chest. She stood frozen, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I don't need a facility," she said, her voice steady but thin. "I'm not sick. I'm not helpless." David sighed, the sound of a man burdened by a task he'd rather not do. "Mom, I don't have time to keep checking on you. I've got work, meetings, a life. This is easier. For both of us. Easier." The word cut deeper than she expected. She wanted to argue, to shout, to remind him of the nights she'd stayed up rocking him through fevers, the years she'd sacrificed for his dreams. But the look in his eyes, distant, resolute, stole the words from her throat. He wasn't asking. He was telling. By noon, strangers were in her home. 2 men in gray uniforms, moving with the detached efficiency of movers hired for a job they didn't care about. They packed her clothes, her books, her life into cardboard boxes labeled with her name in black marker, as if she were a package to be shipped. Margaret stood in the hallway, her chest tight, her breath shallow, watching as her world was dismantled. "David," she tried again, her voice cracking, "please, don't do this." "You fell," he said, not looking up from his phone. "You could have died. I'm doing what's best." Best for whom? She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. They took her in a van, not even his car, the kind of vehicle used for deliveries or hospital transfers. The silence inside was suffocating. broken only by the hum of the engine and the soft click of the driver's radio. Margaret stared out the window, watching her neighborhood fade away. The cedar trees, the mailbox Robert had painted blue, the daisies still swaying in the rain. Her home, her life slipping out of reach. The facility was called Willow Grove, a name that promised peace but delivered something else entirely. It was clean, modern, with wide windows and neutral walls, but it smelled of bleach and something heavier. Abandonment, perhaps, or the slow decay of lives left to fade. They wheeled her to her room, a small space with a single bed, a nightstand, and a chair that wasn't hers. Her name was on a label taped to the door. Margaret Thompson, room 114. Like she was a file, not a person. David followed, carrying a single box of her things. He set it down, checked his watch. "I'll check in later this week," he said, his voice as empty as the room. "You'll be comfortable here, Mom. Don't worry." And then he was gone. No hug, no lingering glance, just the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the bare walls. She didn't cry, not yet. She just sat, the weight of it all pressing down on her. The betrayal, the loss, the realization that her own son had decided she was no longer worth keeping close. That night, she lay in a bed that didn't smell like home, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly in the hallway. She thought of Robert, of the way he'd laugh at the idea of growing old apart, of the promises they'd made to always care for each other. Now he was gone, and David, the boy she'd raised, had put her away like an old coat he no longer needed. But she wasn't nothing. Not yet. Something stirred in her, a flicker of defiance, quiet but fierce. They thought she was finished, that her story was over. They had no idea what she was capable of. She stared at the ceiling, the rain still falling outside, and began to plan. If you're watching this, stay with me. This is my story, and it's not what you expect. Make sure to subscribe to this channel and comment where in the world you're watching from. Your voice matters just like mine did when I decided to fight back. The next morning, Willow Grove woke to the soft rumble of med carts rolling down the halls. Margaret dressed slowly, each movement a small act of resistance, a reminder that she still had control over something. She stepped into the hallway, greeted by tight smiles from staff who didn't know her name. The common area was a sea of muted voices and television noise. Game shows blaring, residents staring blankly or dozing with untouched cups of juice. She was invisible here, just another old woman, just another room number. She found a chair by the window, the Seattle sky heavy with clouds. A squirrel darted across the fence outside, pausing to glance her way. For a moment, she envied its freedom, its ability to run without paperwork or permission. David didn't call that day or the next. On the fourth day, he appeared, his shirt tucked in, his face a mask of obligation. He handed her a stack of insurance papers and 3 photos. One of him as a child, one of Robert holding him as a baby, one of her, cropped from a family vacation like an afterthought. "Is there anything you need?" he asked, his tone implying he hoped she'd say no. She looked at him, searching for the boy she'd raised, the one who'd clung to her during thunderstorms. "I'm thinking," she said simply. He shifted, uncomfortable, as if her quiet defiance unsettled him. "It's not like I don't care, Mom," he said, his voice sharp. "But you've had your time. Let me handle things now." Had her time. The words landed like a slap, as if her life had an expiration date, as if she had nothing left to offer. He left after 10 minutes. No hug, no warmth, just the echo of his words lingering in the sterile air. Margaret sat alone, the photos in her lap, and felt something shift inside her. Not anger, not yet, but a clarity, cold and unyielding. She wasn't just a mother anymore. She was a woman betrayed, and she would not go quietly. The days at Willow Grove blurred into a haze of routine, each one folding into the next like pages in a book no one bothered to read. Margaret Thompson woke to the same sounds every morning. The soft squeak of med carts, the shuffle of slippered feet, the distant cough of a resident down the hall. The air carried the faint sting of bleach, masking something heavier, something that settled into her bones like damp Seattle rain. She dressed in her own clothes, not the facility's shapeless gowns. A quiet act of defiance. Her navy cardigan, her pearl earrings, her silver hair pinned back. Small anchors to the woman she still was, not the number on her door. The common area offered no comfort, just a hum of television static and conversations that never quite reached her. Residents sat in clusters, some staring at game shows with glassy eyes, others clutching plastic cups of juice that went untouched. Margaret took her place by the window, the gray sky outside a mirror to the weight in her chest. She was invisible here, her life reduced to a suitcase and a label. Room 114. She'd been a librarian once, her fingers tracing the spines of Steinbeck and Austen. She'd played Chopin on the piano for Robert every Sunday, the notes filling their home with warmth. She'd baked pies that made neighbors linger at her table. Now, she was just Margaret if anyone bothered to use her name at all. David hadn't called since his brief visit, his words, "You've had your time," still echoing like a wound that wouldn't close. She kept the photos he'd left on her nightstand, not out of love but as a reminder. The boy in the Little League uniform, the baby in Robert's arms, the cropped image of herself. They weren't her family anymore. They were ghosts of a life she'd been forced to leave behind. But Margaret wasn't ready to fade. Not yet. One afternoon, as the rain tapped a steady rhythm against the window, a new face appeared in her doorway. A nurse, younger than the others, her scrubs a soft blue, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun. Her badge read Sarah Carter, but it was her eyes that caught Margaret's attention. Tired, yes, but warm, carrying a weight that felt familiar. "Mrs. Thompson?" she said, her voice gentle, not the clipped tone of the other staff. "I'm Sarah. I'll be checking in on you this week." Margaret nodded, expecting the usual routine: blood pressure, pills, a checklist ticked off. But Sarah sat down, not across the room but close, her clipboard resting on her lap. "Is there anything you want me to know about you?" she asked. The question was so simple, so unexpected, that Margaret froze. No one had asked her that since she'd arrived. Not the aides, not the doctors, not David. She swallowed, her throat tight. "I like crossword puzzles," she said finally, her voice soft. "I make a mean peach cobbler. And I still remember the smell of my husband's cologne." Sarah smiled. Not the tight, professional smile of the staff, but something real, something that reached her eyes. "That's good," she said. "I'd like to know more." And just like that, a crack appeared in the wall Margaret had built around herself. Sarah returned the next day, and the next, each visit a small rebellion against the monotony of Willow Grove. They talked about books, about music, about the way Seattle's rain made everything feel alive. Sarah brought her tea from the staff break room when the dining hall ran out, real chamomile, not the powdered kind. She called her Margaret, not Mrs. Thompson, and remembered that Ella Fitzgerald was her favorite. In return, Margaret listened as Sarah shared pieces of her own life. A 6-year-old daughter named Lily, a mother with Alzheimer's, a husband who'd walked out when the weight of it all became too much. Sarah was 29, her hands calloused from double shifts, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that clung to her like a shadow. She never complained, but Margaret saw it. The way her shoulders sagged when she thought no one was looking, the way her smile flickered when she spoke of Lily's sleepless nights. "She's afraid of the dark," Sarah said one evening, sitting with Margaret in the small garden behind the facility, the air cool and sharp. "Insists I leave the hallway light on. Says it keeps the nightmares away." Margaret smiled. "Smart girl, smarter than me most days," Sarah replied, her voice cracking just enough to betray her. She looked away, brushing at her sleeve, and Margaret didn't press. But she saw her, really saw her, in a way she hadn't seen anyone since Robert. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Margaret thought of Sarah, of the sacrifices she carried, of the loneliness she hid behind that warm laugh. And she thought of David, of the son who'd traded her for convenience, who'd never once asked about her nightmares. The contrast was unbearable, a knife twisting in her chest. She didn't sleep. She planned. The next morning, she asked Sarah for a favor. "I need a phone," she said, her voice steady, "and a quiet place to make a call." Sarah blinked, surprised, but didn't hesitate. "Of course, I'll find a spot." She didn't ask why, didn't pry, but her eyes held a question, a quiet understanding that something bigger was unfolding. By noon, Margaret was in a small office near the staff lounge. The door closed, a borrowed phone in her hand. She dialed a number she hadn't called in years, James Palmer, the family lawyer who'd handled Robert's estate. His voice was warm, familiar, but cautious. "Margaret? It's been a while. I need to make changes to my will," she said, her words deliberate. "And I want to start paperwork for an adult adoption." Pause, heavy with surprise. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more certain." That afternoon, she wrote 2 letters. One to David, short and cold, a mirror to the way he'd treated her. The other to Sarah, sealed and tucked into her nightstand drawer. She wasn't ready to give it to her yet, but when the time came, she wanted Sarah to know she was more than a nurse. She was family. The weeks that followed were a quiet storm. Margaret kept her routine with Sarah, their conversations a lifeline in the sterile sea of Willow Grove. They laughed over Lily's spelling tests, debated the best way to make pie crust, shared stories of loss and love. But beneath it all, Margaret was watching, listening, learning. She noticed the way the staff whispered when David's name came up, the way certain nurses avoided her gaze. And then, one night, she heard something that changed everything. It was past midnight, the facility cloaked in silence, when muffled voices drifted through her cracked door. She slipped out of bed, her shawl around her shoulders, and peered into the hall. At the far end, near the administrator's office, stood David, his silhouette sharp against the yellow light. He was arguing with a man in a suit, his voice low but biting. "If she changes that will, I lose everything," he hissed. The other man, a lawyer Margaret guessed, sighed. "It's her legal right, Daniel. You can't stop her." "She's not thinking clearly," David snapped. "She's alone, confused, probably being manipulated by some staff member. I want a psychological evaluation, something official. If she's declared incompetent, the will can't be changed." Margaret's blood ran cold. She backed into her room, her heart pounding, the door clicking shut behind her. David wasn't just abandoning her. He was trying to erase her, to strip away her voice, her choices, her legacy. And he thought he could do it with paperwork and lies. But he didn't know his mother. He didn't know the fire she still carried, the defiance that had been smoldering since the day he'd wheeled her into this place. She sat on the edge of her bed, trembling not with fear but with resolve. This wasn't just a nursing home anymore. This was a battlefield, and Margaret Thompson was ready to fight. If you're still with me, thank you. This story is about more than me. It's about fighting for your voice when the world tries to silence you. Please subscribe to this channel and share where you're watching from. Your stories matter, and I want to hear them. The air in Willow Grove felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves knew a storm was coming. Margaret Thompson woke each morning with a fire in her chest, her defiance no longer a flicker but a steady flame. She carried David's words, "If she's declared incompetent, the will can't be changed," like a blade, sharpening her resolve with every replay in her mind. She wasn't just fighting for her home or her money. She was fighting for her name, her voice, her right to exist as more than a number on a door. And she wasn't alone. Sarah Carter, the nurse with tired eyes and a heart too big for this place, had become her ally, her confidant, her family. Sarah sensed the shift in Margaret, though she never pried. She brought her tea, sat with her in the garden, shared stories of Lily's latest adventures. Small acts that tethered Margaret to the world outside these beige walls. But when Margaret asked for another favor, her voice low and urgent, Sarah didn't hesitate. "I need you to listen," Margaret said one evening, the Seattle dusk painting the sky in bruises of purple and gray. "When David comes, when he talks to the staff, I need to know what he says." Sarah's brow furrowed, but she nodded. "I'll keep my ears open." It didn't take long. David's visits were rare, but his presence lingered like a shadow. Sarah, working the night shift, overheard him at the nurse's station, his voice sharp and unguarded. She didn't mean to record it. Her phone was in her pocket, meant to stay silent, but a fumble for a pen had pressed the button. His words came through clear, cold, damning. "She's just lonely. Easy to manipulate. That nurse? She's conning her. Once I have her declared unfit, the will goes back to the way it should be. Sarah played the recording for Margaret in the small office the next day. The door locked, their breaths held. Margaret's hands trembled as she listened. Not from fear but from a rage she hadn't known she could still feel. "He thinks he can erase me," she whispered, her voice steel. "He's wrong." Sarah's eyes were wide, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do? "We fight," Margaret said. "And we win." She called James Palmer again, her lawyer's voice a steady anchor on the other end. She told him everything. The recording, David's plan, the psychological evaluation looming like a guillotine. James didn't sugarcoat it. "If they push for incompetence, we'll need more than your word, Margaret. We need evidence. And we need it fast." Sarah took the lead, her quiet strength blooming into something fierce. She tracked down Kristen, a night shift nurse who'd seen David arguing with the administrator after hours. Kristen was young, nervous, her hands twisting as she spoke. "I could lose my job," she said, her voice shaking. Sarah leaned in, her gaze unwavering. "If you stay silent, you're helping him hurt her. You're better than that." Kristen signed a statement, her words simple but damning. David had pressured the staff to document Margaret as unstable, to fabricate signs of confusion. Sarah dug deeper, pulling Margaret's medical records, finding inconsistencies, dates that didn't match, medications listed as refused when Margaret had never seen them, evaluations attributed to her that she'd never given. It was a paper trail of lies, and Sarah held it like a weapon. The hearing came faster than Margaret expected. They moved her to the psychiatric wing first, a calculated step to paint her as unstable. The room was smaller, the bed bolted to the floor, the window barred with safety glass. No phone, no visitors, just the hum of despair and the weight of pills they tried to press into her hand. "For your rest," the nurse said, her eyes avoiding Margaret's. "I don't need rest," Margaret replied, her voice calm but unyielding. "I need the truth." She refused the pills, day after day, her chart filling with words like uncooperative and agitated. But she wasn't agitated. She was awake, her mind sharp, her heart steady. She thought of Robert, of the night he'd died alone, his hand reaching for a phone David never answered. She thought of Sarah, of the letter she'd written, sealed and waiting in her nightstand. And she believed, with every fiber of her being, that Sarah wouldn't let her fade. Outside, Sarah was a force. She met James in his office, her arms full of evidence. Kristen's statement, the medical discrepancies, the recording of David's voice. She didn't flinch when James warned her of the risks, of how David's lawyers would twist her role as a nurse into something sinister. "Let them try," she said, her voice fierce. "I know who Margaret is, and I know what's right." They filed for an emergency hearing, calling it what it was, elder abuse. The courthouse was a small, gray building downtown, its flag tattered by Seattle's relentless wind. Margaret was transported in a van, the orderlies in front joking about lunch while she sat in the back, her hands folded, her heart a drumbeat of resolve. They led her through a side entrance, as if she were something to hide, but inside the courtroom, she saw Sarah, sitting near the front in a navy blouse, her hands clasped tight. Their eyes met, and Sarah nodded, a silent promise. "I'm here." David sat across the room, his suit pristine, his face a mask of confidence. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge the mother he'd tried to erase. His lawyer, a man with slick hair and sharper words, spoke first, painting Margaret as confused, vulnerable, manipulated by a scheming nurse. But James was ready. He stood, his voice calm but unrelenting, laying out the truth like a surgeon's blade. Kristen's statement, the falsified records, and then the recording. David's voice filled the courtroom, smug and unfiltered. "She's just lonely. Easy to manipulate. That nurse? She's conning her." The room went still, the air thick with shock. David's lawyer tried to object, but the judge, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense tone, raised a hand. "I want to hear this," she said. When it was Margaret's turn, she stood, her knees trembling but her voice steady. "I may be old," she said, her eyes locked on the judge, "but I am not confused. I am not senile. I am not finished. I trusted my son. I loved him. I forgave him for things I shouldn't have. But when he let his father die, when he ignored Robert's call for help to protect himself, he crossed a line I cannot forgive. Gasps rippled through the room. David's face drained of color, his hands gripping the table. Margaret continued, her voice rising, clear as a bell. This isn't about money. It's about dignity. It's about being seen, being heard, being human. If my life means nothing to my son but a dollar sign, then I will spend what's left of it with someone who knows my worth. Sarah's eyes glistened, her hand reaching for a tissue. The judge called a recess, her expression unreadable. When they returned, her voice was firm, resolute. Mrs. Thompson is of sound mind and full legal capacity. This court finds the petition for guardianship baseless and frankly disturbing. She turned to David, her gaze cutting. You should consider yourself lucky she hasn't pressed charges. Margaret exhaled, tears spilling down her cheeks, not from sadness but from release. She was free from the locked wing, free from David's control, free to choose her own path. Outside the courthouse, Sarah hugged her, soft but fierce, her voice a whisper. You did it. We did it, Margaret corrected, her hand squeezing Sarah's. They returned to Willow Grove, but it felt different now. Less like a prison and more like a place she'd survived. She packed her things, not in secret but with purpose, ready to leave for a new home with Sarah and Lily. David vanished. No calls, no apologies, just silence. But Margaret wasn't done. She finalized the adoption papers with James, making Sarah her daughter-in-law and heart. And as she closed the door to room 114, she felt it. A new chapter, one she would write herself. This is my story, and it's only beginning. If you're moved, please subscribe to this channel and tell me where you're watching from. Your voice, like mine, deserves to be heard. The new house smelled of fresh paint and possibility. A modest cottage on the edge of Seattle with pale blue shutters and a porch swing that creaked softly in the evening breeze. Margaret Thompson stood in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour, shaping dough for a peach cobbler while Lily, Sarah's 6-year-old daughter, perched on a stool, chattering about her new school. The windows were open, letting in the cool October air, and daisies bloomed in the front yard, their white petals catching the last of the golden light. This was home. Not just the bricks and mortar, but the laughter, the warmth, the life that filled it. Margaret, Sarah, and Lily were a family now, bound not by blood but by choice, by battles fought and won. The courtroom victory had changed everything. Margaret was no longer room 114, no longer a name on a label. She was free, her will intact, her adoption of Sarah finalized in a quiet ceremony that felt like a vow. David had vanished, his silence louder than any apology he might have offered. Margaret didn't expect to hear from him, didn't want to. She'd made peace with the boy he'd been and let go of the man he'd become. But peace, she was learning, could be fragile. It began with a box. Sarah found it while cleaning the basement, a damp corner of the house they'd barely explored since moving in. She'd been organizing old furniture, her sleeves rolled up, when she stumbled on a metal lockbox tucked behind a stack of warped cardboard. It was heavy, rusted at the edges, with RT scratched into the lid. Robert Thompson, Margaret's late husband. Sarah carried it upstairs, her brow furrowed, and set it on the kitchen table where Margaret was sipping tea. Margaret, Sarah said, her voice hesitant. I think this belonged to Robert. Margaret's hand froze on her cup, her eyes tracing the familiar initials. She hadn't seen that box in years, hadn't known it was still in the house. Robert had kept it in his office, a private space for papers he didn't share, even with her. Open it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah pried the lid with a screwdriver, the hinges groaning as they gave way. Inside were letters, dozens of them, yellowed and brittle, tied with twine. There were financial records too, pages of numbers and notes in Robert's precise handwriting. Margaret untied the twine, her fingers trembling, and began to read. The words hit like a tide, pulling her under. The letters were from Robert to a colleague, written in the months before his death. They detailed a crisis at his real estate firm, Debts piling up, investors pulling out, a partner pushing risky deals that threatened to bankrupt them. That partner was David. Robert had warned him, begged him to stop, but David had doubled down, funneling money into failing projects, hiding losses to protect his reputation. The stress, Robert wrote, was killing him. I can't sleep. My chest hurts. I don't know how much longer I can hold this together. Margaret's breath caught, her vision blurring with tears. She remembered that night. Robert in his office, alone, clutching his chest as he dialed David's number. She'd been at a friend's, unaware, until the hospital called. David had claimed he hadn't spoken to his father, hadn't known. But the final letter told a different story. David knows, Robert wrote. He knows the company's collapsing. He knows I'm breaking. If I don't make it, he'll let it all fall to save himself. Sarah reached for her hand, her voice soft but urgent. Margaret, what does this mean? It means he didn't just let Robert die, Margaret said, her voice shaking with a rage she could barely contain. He pushed him toward it. The truth settled like lead in her chest. David hadn't just ignored his father's call. He'd created the pressure that broke him, the debt that crushed him, the silence that left him alone in his final moments. Margaret wanted to scream, to tear the letters apart, but she didn't. She folded them carefully, her hands steady despite the storm inside her. We need to keep this safe, she said. And we need James. They called James Palmer that night, his voice grave as Margaret read him excerpts over the phone. This changes everything, he said. If you want to pursue this, it's not just about the will anymore. It's about accountability, maybe even criminal negligence. Margaret hesitated, the weight of it pressing down. David was her son, her flesh and blood, the boy she'd rocked through storms. But he was also the man who'd betrayed her, who'd let Robert die, who'd tried to lock her away. I need time, she said finally. But don't let these letters out of your sight. The next few days were quiet, but the air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. Margaret went through the motions, baking with Lily, tending the daisies, laughing at Sarah's stories. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying Robert's words, David's cold eyes, the life she'd lost. Sarah watched her closely, her warmth a steady anchor, but even she couldn't ease the ache. Then one night it happened. Margaret was asleep, the house dark and still, when a noise jolted her awake. A soft thud from downstairs, like a door easing shut. She sat up, her heart racing, and glanced at the clock. 2:17 a.m. Lily was in her room, Sarah asleep down the hall. Margaret slipped on her robe, her bare feet cold against the hardwood, and crept to the stairs. A shadow moved in the living room, quick and deliberate, near the kitchen table where the lockbox still sat. She froze, her breath shallow. The shadow was David. He was rifling through the box, his movements frantic, papers spilling onto the floor. He hadn't seen her yet, his focus on the letters, but the creak of a floorboard betrayed her. His head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light, and for a moment, neither spoke. Mom, he said, his voice low, almost a growl. You shouldn't be up. What are you doing here, David? Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled at her sides. He straightened, a letter crumpled in his fist. You don't understand what you found, he said. These letters, they'll ruin me. Everything I've built, everything Dad left me. You can't do this. You did this? She shot back, stepping closer, her fear giving way to fury. You let him die. You broke him and you left him alone. And now you're here, in my home, trying to take what's left. David's face twisted, a mix of anger and desperation. You don't get it. I had to make choices. Hard ones. Dad was weak, Mom. He couldn't handle it. I did what I had to do to survive. Survive? Margaret's voice rose, sharp enough to cut. You call this surviving? Stealing from your father's grave? Locking me away? You're not surviving, David. You're destroying. He took a step toward her, the letter still in his hand, and for a moment, she thought he might lunge. But a light flicked on upstairs, and Sarah's voice called out, firm and fierce. Margaret? What's going on? David froze, his eyes darting to the stairs as Sarah appeared. her phone in one hand, Lily peeking from behind her. "Get out," Sarah said, her voice low but unyielding. "Now, or I call the police." David hesitated, his jaw tight, then dropped the letter and backed toward the door. "This isn't over," he said, his eyes locked on Margaret. "You'll regret this." He slipped into the night, the door slamming behind him. Margaret's knees buckled, and Sarah caught her, guiding her to a chair. Lily ran to her, wrapping small arms around her waist, and Margaret held them both, her tears falling silently. The letters lay scattered on the floor, a truth too heavy to ignore. Sarah locked the door, her hands shaking but her voice steady. "He won't touch you again," she said. "I promise." Margaret nodded, her heart still racing, but something else stirred inside her. A clarity, a resolve. David had come for her once, and he'd come again. But this time, she wasn't just protecting herself. She was protecting Sarah, Lily, the family she'd chosen. And she would fight with everything she had. The Seattle sky hung low and gray, heavy with the promise of rain, as Margaret Thompson stepped out of the cottage, her coat pulled tight against the November chill. The daisies in the front yard stood defiant, their petals curling inward, bracing for the storm. Inside, Sarah was helping Lily with her homework, their laughter a soft hum that warmed the house even on days like this. Margaret carried that warmth with her now, a shield against the cold reality she was about to face. David hadn't stayed silent for long. His threat, "This isn't over," had been a promise, and he was keeping it. A letter from James Palmer had arrived days after the break-in, its contents as sharp as a blade. David, backed by a high-powered law firm, was contesting the will again, this time with a new angle: undue influence. He claimed Sarah had manipulated Margaret, preying on her loneliness to secure the inheritance. Worse, he accused Sarah of elder abuse, painting her as a predator who'd wormed her way into Margaret's life for profit. The allegations didn't stop there. David's lawyers had filed a motion questioning Sarah's fitness as a mother, suggesting her exploitation of Margaret made her unfit to raise Lily. It was a calculated strike, designed not just to reclaim the estate but to destroy the family Margaret had built. Margaret's hands had trembled as she read the letter, not from fear but from a fury that burned brighter with each word. David wasn't just coming for her money. He was coming for her heart, for Sarah, for Lily. She'd looked at Sarah, sitting across the kitchen table, her face pale but resolute. "He won't win," Sarah had said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Not this time." James had been blunt. "This is bigger than the last hearing," he'd told them over the phone. "The media's caught wind of it. Elder abuse is a hot topic, and David's team is playing it up. We need to be airtight. And we need to be ready for anything." Margaret had nodded, her jaw tight. She'd faced David once and won. She could do it again. But this time, the stakes were higher, the spotlight brighter. Reporters lingered outside the courthouse, their cameras flashing like vultures circling. The story had spread. Elderly woman's will Sparks family feud, and Margaret's quiet fight had become a public spectacle. She didn't want the attention, didn't want her pain splashed across headlines, but she had no choice. This was war, and she would not surrender. The courtroom was larger this time, its wooden benches filled with spectators, their whispers a low hum beneath the fluorescent lights. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table, her silver hair pinned back, her hands folded, her eyes steady. Sarah was beside her, her navy blouse pressed, her posture rigid but unbroken. Lily was with a neighbor, too young for the ugliness of this room, but Margaret felt her presence, a small, fierce light in her heart. Across the aisle, David sat with his new lawyer, a woman with sharp features and sharper words, her suit tailored to intimidate. David's face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the judge's bench, never once meeting Margaret's gaze. The judge, an older man with a lined face and a voice like gravel, called the room to order. David's lawyer, Ms. Hargrove, stood first, her tone dripping with rehearsed sympathy. "Mrs. Thompson is a vulnerable senior," she began, her words smooth and practiced. "Lonely, grieving, easily swayed. Sarah Carter, a nurse with access and opportunity, saw a chance to exploit that vulnerability. She inserted herself into Mrs. Thompson's life, gained her trust, and coerced her into changing her will and adopting her. An act no rational person would make without undue influence. Margaret's nails dug into her palms, her breath shallow. She wanted to stand, to shout that Sarah was her daughter, her choice, her family. But she waited, trusting James, trusting the truth. Hargrove continued, her accusations growing bolder. Sarah had neglected her duties, falsified records, manipulated Margaret's emotions. She called witnesses, a former Willow Grove aide who claimed Sarah spent too much time with Margaret, a social worker who questioned the adoption speed. Each word was a twist of the knife, but Margaret held her ground, her eyes locked on Sarah, who sat pale but unbowed. James stood, his presence calm but commanding. "This case isn't about influence," he said, his voice cutting through the room. "It's about control. David Thompson wants to control his mother's legacy because he believes it's his by right. But Margaret Thompson is not a possession. She is a woman of sound mind, full capacity, and unwavering clarity." He presented the adoption papers airtight and legal. He replayed the recording from the first hearing, David's voice smug and damning. "She's just lonely. Easy to manipulate." He submitted Kristen's statement, the falsified medical records, and a new piece of evidence, the letters from Robert, detailing David's role in the firm's collapse. The courtroom stirred, whispers rising like a tide. Hargrove objected, arguing the letters were irrelevant, but the judge overruled her. "I'll decide what's relevant," he said, his eyes narrowing. Margaret felt a flicker of hope, but it was tempered by the weight of what came next. Sarah took the stand, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. She spoke of her years at Willow Grove, her spotless record, her love for Lily. She spoke of Margaret, not as a patient, but as a friend, a mentor, a mother. "I didn't ask for her money," Sarah said, her eyes meeting Margaret's. "I didn't ask for her love. She gave it freely and I gave mine back. That's what family does." Hargrove pounced, her questions sharp and accusing. "You expect us to believe you had no motive? That you didn't see dollar signs when you befriended a wealthy widow?" Sarah didn't flinch, her gaze unwavering. "I saw a woman who deserved to be seen," she said. "That's all." Margaret was next. She stood, her knees aching but her spine straight, and faced the room. "I am not a victim," she said, her voice clear, resonant. "I am not confused. I chose Sarah because she chose me. When my own son turned his back, when he tried to lock me away, when he let my husband die to save himself. David calls it influence. I call it loyalty. I call it love." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone. David shifted, his mask slipping, his eyes darting to his lawyer. Hargrove tried to twist Margaret's testimony, suggesting grief had clouded her judgment. But Margaret cut her off. "Grief didn't cloud my judgment," she said. "It clarified it. I see my son for who he is, and I see Sarah for who she's always been." The hearing stretched into the afternoon, tension coiling tighter with each witness, each argument. Then, as the judge prepared to recess, a court clerk approached, holding an envelope. "Your Honor," she said, "this was delivered for you. From a Lily Carter." Margaret's breath caught. Sarah's eyes widened. The judge opened the envelope, his brow furrowing as he read. "It's a letter," he said, his voice softening. "From a child." He read aloud, his gravelly tone carrying a new weight. "Dear Judge, my name is Lily. I'm 6. Margaret is my grandma now, not because of money but because she loves me. She helps me with my homework and makes me laugh. My mom loves her too. Please don't take them away from me. They're my family." The courtroom fell silent, the air thick with emotion. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Margaret reached for her, their fingers intertwining, a lifeline in the storm. The judge set the letter down, his expression unreadable, and called a recess. "We'll reconvene tomorrow," he said, but his voice held something new, compassion, perhaps, or clarity. Outside, reporters swarmed, their questions a barrage, but Margaret and Sarah walked past, hand in hand, their silence louder than any statement. They picked up Lily from the neighbors, And that night, in the cottage, they sat together, Lily curled in Margaret's lap, Sarah's arm around them both. "You wrote a letter," Margaret said softly, brushing Lily's hair. Lily nodded, her voice small but proud. "I wanted to help." "You did," Margaret said, her eyes glistening. "You did, but the battle wasn't over." David's team would regroup, their accusations sharper, their tactics dirtier. Margaret knew it, felt it in her bones. Yet as she looked at Sarah and Lily, she felt something stronger. A certainty that no matter what came, they would face it together. The storm was still gathering, but Margaret was ready. Her heart a fortress, her family her strength. The courtroom was quieter today, the air thick with anticipation, like the moment before a storm breaks. Margaret Thompson sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded, her silver hair catching the pale light filtering through the courthouse windows. Sarah sat beside her, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair, her eyes fixed on the judge's bench. The Seattle rain had stopped, leaving the world outside washed clean. But inside, the weight of the past months pressed down on them all. Lily's letter, small but seismic, had shifted something in the room yesterday, and Margaret could feel it. A turning tide, a truth too clear to ignore. The judge entered, his lined face solemn, his voice steady as he called the room to order. David sat across the aisle, his suit still pristine but his posture less certain, his eyes darting to his lawyer, Miss Hargrove, whose sharp confidence seemed to waver. The spectators leaned forward, reporters scribbling in their notebooks, their pens scratching like whispers of judgment. Margaret didn't look at David. She didn't need to. She'd seen enough of the man he'd become. The judge cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping the room. "I've reviewed the evidence, the testimonies, and the letter from Lily Carter," he began, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs. "This case is not about money, though some would have us believe it is. It's about family, about trust, and about the right to choose one's legacy." He paused, his eyes settling on Margaret. "Mrs. Thompson has demonstrated, beyond any doubt, that she is of sound mind and full capacity. Her decisions, to amend her will to adopt Sarah Carter, are her own, made with clarity and conviction." Margaret exhaled, her chest loosening, but she held herself still, waiting. The judge turned to David, his expression hardening. "Mr. Thompson, your actions, falsifying records, attempting to declare your mother incompetent, and now these baseless accusations against Ms. Carter, show a pattern of manipulation that this court cannot ignore. Your petition is denied. Furthermore, I am referring your conduct to the State Bar Association for review, and I strongly suggest you reconsider your priorities." A murmur rippled through the room, sharp and electric. David's face drained of color, his hands clenching into fists, but he said nothing. Hargrove whispered something to him, her voice urgent, but he shook his head, his mask of control crumbling. The judge continued, his tone softer now, almost reflective. "As your mother, Ms. Carter, and you, Lily, have shown this court what family means. Hold on to that. It's worth more than any inheritance." The gavel fell and it was over. Margaret reached for Sarah's hand, their fingers intertwining, a silent vow. Lily, waiting outside with a neighbor, would hear the news soon, her letter now a part of history, a testament to love over greed. Reporters swarmed as they left the courthouse, but Margaret and Sarah walked past, their heads high, their steps steady. They didn't need to speak. Their silence was their strength, their family their victory. Back at the cottage, the air smelled of fresh bread and basil, the kitchen alive with the chaos of dinner preparations. Lily ran through the house, her laughter echoing, her butterfly net abandoned on the porch. Margaret set Robert's photo on the mantel, his smile a quiet blessing, and Sarah hung Lily's latest drawing beside it. A stick-figure family, 3 women holding hands under a bright sun. They ate together, the table small but full, their voices weaving stories of the day, of tomorrow, of dreams no one could take away. Days later, a letter arrived from James. David's world had collapsed. His real estate ventures had crumbled, investors fleeing after the public scandal. Bankruptcy loomed, his reputation in tatters. He disappeared. No calls, No threats, just silence. Margaret didn't smile, didn't gloat. She folded the letter and set it aside, her heart heavy but free. Justice had whispered, not roared, and that was enough. The garden became her sanctuary, the soil soft under her hands, the daisies thriving in the winter light. She planted wildflower seeds with Lily, their fingers dirty, their laughter bright. Sarah joined them, her nursing certification upgraded, her dreams of a private care service taking shape. They were a family, not perfect, but real, built on choices made in the dark and carried into the light. One afternoon, Margaret sat on the porch swing, a sunflower in her hand, its petals turned toward the sun. She thought of Robert, of the promises they'd kept, of the love that had outlived him. She thought of David, the boy she'd lost, and let him go, not with anger but with peace. And she thought of Sarah and Lily, her daughters, her home, her heart. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold and pink, and Margaret smiled. She'd thought growing old meant fading, but she'd been wrong. It meant fighting, choosing, loving. It meant standing in the light no matter how dark the storm. She held the sunflower close, its warmth a reminder. Blood might abandon you, but love saves you. Margaret closed her eyes, the swing creaking softly, Lily's giggles floating from the yard, Sarah's voice calling them in for dinner. This was her story, her legacy, her home, and no one could take it away.